Yeah, but just thanks so much for being here again. Looking forward to even learning from you in terms of the questions you have about the Transfiguration. So, as Nijay said, I'm in Kansas City, Missouri. So we've bought into the Chiefs kingdom. I guess everyone else hates us now, but we are bought in. We're all Swifties now, now or something like that. But yeah, I teach New Testament biblical theology. My focus has been narrative portions of the New Testament primarily. So Gospels and Acts have kind of been my main focus in my scholarly career, but I'm kind of interested in everything. So that's kind of, maybe I'm like Nijay in that way, that we kind of write on a bunch of different things. So married to Hannah, we have 4 young kids. That's why I'm in the office, because at school I wouldn't be able to get much done. They're all at school right now, but they'll come home at some point here. Actually, in about an hour. The older 2 get home at like 2:20, and then the next 2 get home at like 4 o'clock. So the timing doesn't work out very well. But love being here in Kansas City. Love my family, and love to just teach the Bible and talk to people about the Bible and show them new things in the Scripture. So anything else, Nijay, you want me to say? I don't have a slideshow. I'm sorry. I'm just going to
I
talk
think
and
you
then.
covered it. Yes,
Okay.
that's fine.
Okay,
Go for
great.
it.
Okay, so what I want to do for this is set up kind of the large argument of the book, so the big picture of the book, my main argument, my main thesis for the book, and then I'm going to jump down into one detail in the Transfiguration narrative. You can look at it in Matthew 17, Mark 9, or Luke 9. That's where the event takes place. Second Peter 1 as well tells a little bit about the Transfiguration. But I won't be able to cover everything, obviously. So I'm just going to kind of give you a snapshot. And maybe the first thing I'll say is the reason I was interested in writing this is because I've kind of fallen into this train of thought in terms of doing more neglected aspects of Christ's life. It almost happened by accident. It wasn't really a plan of mine, but I did a book previously on the Ascension. And then now I did one on the Transfiguration. I kind of have a plan to maybe do one on Christ's descent, Gethsemane, kind of those events that we know are important, but we just maybe don't spend as much time thinking about, because we spend more time on his birth, his death, his resurrection, which are hugely important, but we don't think a lot about the Transfiguration. So even asking yourself, like, have you ever read a book on the Transfiguration? Have you ever heard a sermon on the Transfiguration? Have you ever sung a song about the Transfiguration? Those are all questions that I usually get no. And even if you were to summarize Jesus's life, like get like a 5-minute summary, would you say anything about the Transfiguration? Maybe you would, but I think many people wouldn't. They would actually just kind of bypass that event. And this reality, I talk about this in the book, but this reality became very clear to me when I went to our library to start working on this book. I thought, well, now time to pick up all the resources on the Transfiguration from our library. And we have a good library. It's not massive. We have a good library at our school. And I went to the Jesus section, and the books on the resurrection is just like shelf after shelf of resurrection books, which is great. And then shelf after shelf on atonement and death. And I looked for the Transfiguration section, and there were literally three books on the shelves, on our shelves of the Transfiguration. And I think for many people, you might not even be able to name one. And I couldn't before that. There wasn't many that I could find. And so that just, again, confirmed to me there's not a lot done on this event. That's not necessarily true, though, for the Eastern tradition. Interestingly, the Western tradition has spent less time on the Transfiguration than the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And so Nijay sent me some funny texts about how much I use the Eastern Fathers for this book, but it was somewhat necessary. It's like, who are my conversation partners? And so it is kind of a neglected event. And I think part of the reason for that is we just don't know what to do with it. We just don't know what to do with this event. It's a strange kind of mystical, sometimes I say, if hopefully it's not heterodox to say this, but light bright Jesus event, right? Where his clothes become so clean that you don't even need OxyClean. So that it is a strange event. Like if you're talking about it in church or with just Christians, they're like, what's going on here? So that kind of launches me into the study of this. But let me set up my argument for the whole book. So my argument in this book addresses both people in the church and scholars, and I was actually a little afraid that the book would fall between the pews because of that. So my guess is that when people in the church, I'm very involved in the local church and in the academy, and so I always feel like I'm hearing both sides of things. But my guess is that when people in the church read this scene, the transfiguration, they draw from the account that Jesus being transfigured means that he's God, and maybe even that his godness overwhelms his humanity so that he becomes like a spiritual being again, like it erases his flesh. I don't know if people would necessarily say that, but maybe that's kind of in the background, even of their mind in terms of what they think of the transfiguration, like what's happening here. On the opposite side, we have scholars who tend to view this scene in the academy as not showing that Jesus is God, but displaying the future glory he will receive as a human being. So scholars tend to only see Jesus's earthly mission in the transfiguration. People in the church only see Jesus's divinity, and neither seem to connect the two. My argument in this book is that they're both right and they're both wrong. They're both right in one sense in what they affirm and wrong in what they deny, and they haven't looked at the transfiguration more carefully. Scholars only see Jesus's earthly mission, and people in the church only see Jesus's divinity. So James Dunn, who's a great scholar, he's representative of the modern scholarly view when he asserts that in the transfiguration, so this is a theological reading, there's no thought of pre-existence, like my reading is a theological reading. So Dunn supports this argument. I think he has some good arguments, but he says three things to say there's no thought of pre-existence for Christ in the transfiguration. First, I think this is Christology in the Making. It might be from it's the book it's from. I can't remember right now. First, the Gospels saw the episode as foreshadowing Jesus's resurrection and exaltation. Second, Jesus's transformation and the cloud recalls the glorification of Moses. You can especially see that in Matthew's Gospel. And third, the dazzling white garments are typical of heavenly beings, including glorified saints and angels. And so all of this points towards no thought of pre-existence. Rather, he's just a glorified human being. Dunn concludes, there is certainly nothing like a clear allusion to the pre-existent glory here, and probably no implication of incarnation at all. Dunn's not alone. Bob Stein notes that people view the transfiguration in his Mark commentary, I think it is, as either with Baker, as either a sign of the pre-incarnate glory of Christ or a proleptic glimpse of the glory of the Son of Man in his future coming. So Stein concludes, nothing in the account suggests that Jesus possessed before the transfiguration a hidden glory that was veiled up to this point. So again, he's seeing the narrative in the same way as James Dunn. John Paul Heel, I think is how you pronounce it, Heel. He has a whole book on the transfiguration, and he argues that the transfiguration describes Jesus's external, proleptic, and temporary transformation by God into a heavenly being while still on earth. More pointedly, he states that the transfiguration does not support interpretations that speak in terms of an unveiling, disclosure, or revelation of glory that Jesus already possesses. Later, he says it's not an internal self-transformation, but an external transformation affected by God. So my argument is in response to both these schools, is that people in the church and scholars are both right and they're both wrong. The problem is not in what they affirm, but what they deny. My argument, in short, is that the transfiguration reveals Jesus's double sonship. That's the short way of putting it. It reveals Jesus's double sonship. The long way of putting it is in the transfiguration, both the future glory of the earthly and suffering messianic Son is revealed, and the pre-existent glory of the heavenly and eternally begotten Son are revealed. Both are revealed at the same time. Understood in this way, the mountaintop experience or the mountaintop revelation might be the clearest narrative picture we have of the two natures of Christ in one person, what the church has confessed historically, and possibly, I think, a key resource for the early church in articulating Jesus's ontology. So you think of language like light from light in the Nicene Creed. The transfiguration is both forward-looking in this way and backward-looking, both anticipation and retrospection, both expectation and recognition. In fact, these two realities, I would argue, can't be divorced. Jesus could only be the faithful Messiah and receive glory from the Father because this glory was already his. You hear that in John's language. John 17:5 says, Father, glorify me with the glory that I had before the world existed. The future glory of the Messianic Son is grounded in his eternally begotten nature. So the Transfiguration concerns how Jesus is both man and God, where God's work, and here I use systematic theology language, but ad intra and ad extra meet. It tells us who the Son is and who he will be. It speaks of the Son in terms of his ontology and his mission. And we can distinguish those things, but we don't divide the Son's divinity and his humanity because it comes in one person. Certainly, some biblical texts speak more about Jesus' nature before time. Other texts more speak about Jesus' work in salvation history. But the Transfiguration, I think, uniquely brings both together at this kind of fulcrum moment. Jesus' humanity is transfigured and his deity is revealed. Let me say that again. Jesus' humanity is transfigured and his deity is revealed. So I really walk through a lot of the details in the text to show this, but I want to go to one point in the Transfiguration narrative to hopefully prove this, or that I think maybe it doesn't prove it. That's probably overstating it. Suggests that this is the case, and that's the detail.
Patrick, can I interrupt you real quick? Can you do me a favor? Given our unfamiliarity with the Transfiguration, can you do a quick, like, these are the basics of it? What happens where? I know.
Sure. Yeah. I should have done that.
So number one, what are the basics? No, it's I mean, we should know this, but like, what are the basics? And then how are they slightly different synoptically or even in the fourfold? Just in just a couple of minutes, give us the basics.
Sure. So Jesus goes up on a mountain with three of his disciples, Peter, James, and John. It says the 6th day in 2 of the Gospels. On Luke, it says the 8th day. And he's transfigured before them. That means, according to Matthew, his face shines like the sun. And then his clothes turn dazzlingly white. And then next to him appears Moses and Elijah. And Peter ends up saying something that all the Gospels seem to agree. He doesn't really know what he's saying, but he says, let us build 3 tents here for you. And then the voice comes from the heaven. It says, out of the cloud, this voice comes, and it says, this is my beloved son. In Luke, it says, this is my chosen one. Listen to him. And then they look up. It's only Jesus there. In Matthew, he goes and he touches them. They have fallen down as if dead because they've seen something. They've seen a revelation of Jesus Christ. In terms of the context, this is important. I talk about this in the book, but it is important that it only occurs in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, although I think John has the imagery of the Transfiguration kind of woven throughout his narrative. And that is interesting because John's on the mountain with with Jesus, right? If you agree that that's the same John. So, what's interesting is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it occurs at the same place in all the narratives. That's not always true for all of Jesus's actions. A lot of times they move it around and they put it in its own particular place. But I think each gospel writer thought it was important that this comes post Peter's confession that Jesus is the Messiah and post Jesus's clarification that, yes, he is the Messiah, but he's going to go to the cross and die. And so this ultimately is a scene of hope and revelation. Yes, I'm going to die, but that's not the end. This is my future glory. And I would argue my pre-existent glory, right? And so he's giving them hope by saying, hey, come up on the mountain with me. You 3 are going to be uniquely involved in my death. And so he reveals his glory to them in that way. Did I get to your questions, Nijay?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah. Oh, I didn't talk about differences, but maybe I can. You want me to go through that or no?
You talked a little bit about them. Are there major differences? Are there like, oh, wow, this is really
it's different? Only minor differences. It's like some of them list Elijah's name first and others list Moses's names first. The one interesting difference is Luke doesn't use the word metamorphosis, that Greek term. He says his appearance was changed. And most people conclude that's probably because he doesn't want them to think of the Greco-Roman gods kind of metamorphosizing.
Yeah.
And so he's avoiding that term, while Mark and Matthew are more, they're fine with that. The other thing to note is it's the same word. Metamorphosis is the same word for transformed in Romans 12, 1 and 2. And 2 Corinthians 3, I think it's 18. So we are being transformed by beholding him, or be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So that word only occurs 4 times in the whole New Testament. And we think of transformed and transfigure as two different things, but I think ultimately they are the same thing. One applies to us and one applies to Jesus, but as we're united to Christ, we are transfigured. That's the same idea. And so yeah, there's other minor differences, but I don't think they're major, so maybe I won't spend as much time here.
Okay, I'll let you carry on, but just
okay, yeah,
answer me this, because I just wondered. You'd probably get in trouble if you called the book The Transformation of Christ, because that's hard to look up the actual event that way. But how did the word transfigure become kind of what it, I mean, it had to happen, in early English, but how did it come to have that terminology? And do you think that's the best way to refer to it?
You mean transform or transfigure?
Transfigure, it's some point in English, it had to have just been stabilized as that terminology.
Oh, you mean for Jesus versus us?
Yeah, for the event. Yeah.
Yeah, the event. Yeah. I don't know. Actually, I'm not sure entirely how to answer that. Certainly, and maybe this isn't quite getting to your question. It was called the Transfiguration because that word is so sparingly used in the New Testament, and so the main event is he's transfigured before them. Interestingly, though, Second Peter actually focuses more on the voice than what happened to Jesus's like physical being. And so some people have been like, no, that's the voice from heaven that's more important. I think that's a false dichotomy. I think the two support one another ultimately. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that. I note in the book that in German, it's actually called the glorification. It's not called the transfiguration. And so they just call it the glorification. They don't use, Luke uses the term doxa, but I don't think the other writers use the term doxa except Peter when he's narrating again. But I think that idea of glory and light ultimately coincide in the scriptures. And so I do know that we don't, for some reason, we English translators didn't want to use the same term for what happened to Jesus as for us, which I actually think kind of it makes things a little fuzzy. Paul seems to want to bring them together in 2 Corinthians 3, that we behold him as he is, and then we become like him in 1 John 3. And so I'm not entirely happy that we use transformed for us and transfigured for Jesus. I would just rather use the same term to see that relationship of you get to participate in Christ's glorification as you are united to him. I think that's really the theology of the New Testament. So
thank you. Sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I think, yeah, question and answer would have been just as good. You probably don't want to hear me drone on the whole time. So, okay. So I'm just going to drill down on why did Moses and Elijah appear in the Transfiguration narrative to support my argument. When you think about it, it could have been anyone. It could have been Adam and Eve. It could have been Enoch. It could have been Abraham. It could have been David. It could have been Daniel. It could have been Esther, right? Why is it Moses and Elijah that appear with Jesus in the Transfiguration? And there's a few different, I have 8 reasons why people have proposed this, but I think they can be categorized in covenantal views of these figures or individual events that happened in their lives. I don't think those two can be separated, but it's actually helpful to say there's a more covenantal biblical storyline reason, and then there's more their roles as individuals. So I'm going to go through 4 reasons for each covenantal, why I think they appear, and then individual figures, and then we'll wrap it back up to my thesis. So first, as covenantal figures, many throughout church history and in the modern times assert Moses and Elijah appeared because they are covenantal figures who represent the law, Moses, and the prophets. Cyril affirmed that they appear because Jesus has been preceded by the law and the prophets and been revealed in the law and the prophets. Calvin said they appeared to demonstrate that Christ alone is the end of the law and the prophets. And as we turn to the scriptures throughout the New Testament, the phrase the law and the prophets summarizes Israel's scriptures. You can see that in Matthew, Luke, John, Acts, Romans. Matthew seems to be the paradigmatic, or Moses seems to be the paradigmatic figure for the law. For example, in Luke 16:29, when the rich man asks Abraham to send someone back from his father's house, Abraham says, they have Moses and the prophets. So there, Moses kind of stands for the law in Luke 16:29. Elijah also seems to stand as a major prophetic figure. John the Baptist is linked to Elijah, and Elijah is said to return in the Old Testament. In summary, Moses and Elijah appear, therefore, to represent the harmony of the Bible and to indicate the whole of the scriptures are both completed in Jesus and point forward to him. I think this interpretation has numerous strengths throughout the Gospels, especially Matthew. Jesus affirms he's the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. You think of Matthew 5:17. Therefore, the transfiguration scene confirms Jesus fulfills Israel's scriptures, even though, or maybe precisely because, he's going to his death. You could say this view has a few weaknesses. While some argue Moses wrote much of the law, Elijah didn't write any of the prophetic literature. And if you look through the New Testament, the argument for him standing for all the prophets is maybe not as solid as some people think, to just kind of spout law and the prophets and without doing the research of, is that really what he stands for? So minor weaknesses to that view, but I actually agree that is part of the reason why they're there. Here's the second reason as covenantal figures. It's a closely related, but Moses and Elijah appear possibly to signify they are servants and Jesus is the master. This is, I think, a sub-point of the previous one, but specifies why Moses and Elijah appear as representative of Israel's scriptures as whole. The danger with the first view is you just say, okay, they represent the law and the prophets, but that leaves it unspecified. However, when the Father says in this narrative and all the narratives, listen to him, he makes Moses and Elijah subservient to Jesus. So notice the listen to him is singular. It's not listen to them, it's listen to him. So the appearance of Moses and Elijah therefore supports, I think, the argument of Hebrews 3. Jesus is considered worthy of more glory than Moses, just as the builder has more honor than the house. Moses was faithful as a servant, but Christ was faithful as a son. Interesting. Listen to him. This is my beloved son, right? A third view is that Moses and Elijah appear to satisfy the legal requirements of the two witnesses. Two witnesses are necessary in Jewish law for a legal process to be heard. Deuteronomy 19:15 says one witness cannot establish any iniquity or sin against a person, whatever that person has done. A fact must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Moses and Elijah therefore function as witnesses to Jesus's glory. Some, and I think this is interesting to think about, some have additionally noted that Moses and Elijah are heavenly witnesses who support maybe Jesus's divine identity. Peter and James and John are earthly witnesses who support Jesus's humanity. You could look at it that way. Maybe that's pressing it too far. But they honor Jesus by appearing beside him. The context of the transfiguration scene is that of the coming kingdom, and they flank him as almost a royal procession would. Almost like it's picturing his triumphal entry, if this is pointing forward to his resurrection and return. While this point might have some merit and even could be a sub-point of some of the options listed above, it doesn't seem to be the main reason they appear, because it doesn't really explain why Moses and Elijah appear. It could have been anyone, right? So it still leaves things a little unspecific, although I think for many of these views, I think there's some truth to it. Fourth, under the covenantal view, others argue Moses and Elijah appear to represent the inauguration of a new era. Israel's scriptures predicted that both a Moses and Elijah figure would emerge before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So you think of texts like Deuteronomy 18:18, where God says he will raise up a prophet from them among their brothers like Moses. And you think of Malachi 4, which says the Lord will send another Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord. The positive of this argument is that it gives more specificity than simply saying Moses and Elijah are a sign of the law and the prophets. The presence of these two figures indicates the end has drawn near, and Jesus himself is the new Moses and Elijah in one sense. Supporting this view is the context which places Jesus's transfiguration under the umbrella of the coming kingdom. However, I think it also has some weaknesses. Jesus specifically links Elijah to John the Baptist. Jesus says Elijah has already come, referring to John the Baptist. Additionally, the question might be asked whether the transfiguration is about the inauguration of the new age or a preview of the consummation of the new age. Ultimately, that's probably dividing things too neatly, as the last day should be viewed as a whole. Therefore, I think this argument does have some merit. So in summary, a covenantal view of Moses and Elijah begins with them representing the law and the prophets. Then some dive deeper and say, hey, they're servants to the master, they're witnesses to Jesus, or they signify the new era has arrived. Okay, so that's the first part. Second part, am I going too fast? I know it's just like fire hydrant, but Okay, I'm going to go to individuals. What happened in their lives as individuals, and then you guys can ask me questions about whatever. So now we turn to Moses and Elijah as individuals. Some throughout history, the history of interpretation, have moved more towards specific events that happen in Moses and Elijah's lives. The strength of these positions is they specify why it's particularly Moses and Elijah who appear, and not other covenantal heads, because you do have other what we call covenantal heads in the Old Testament. First, some say Moses and Elijah appear because they signify Jesus' authority over life and death. A spatial point exists to Moses and Elijah being called. Moses comes up from the dead, and Elijah comes down from heaven. Many of the church fathers spoke in this way. Moses died and was buried, but Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. By calling these two specific figures to his side, Jesus indicates he has authority over every realm, heaven, earth, and under the earth. Think of Philippians 2, verse 10. Jesus, therefore, is the Lord of the living and the dead. As one church father says, he lured Elijah down from heaven. He fished Moses up from below. He set Peter and James and John alongside him from those still on the earth, for the whole is known from the extremes. In other words, Jesus is calling everyone from the extremes and saying it's all going to be united in me. It's a neat image. This is important for the context because the apostles need to understand death will never reign over the righteous. So he calls Elijah down and Moses up. And I think while this view is attractive, it still has some fuzziness around why Moses and Elijah appear. Others died, and Enoch was also taken up to heaven. I also wonder if the main point of the Transfiguration is the authority or the glory of Jesus. I think that's a fair question to ask. The preamble to the Transfiguration does speak of it as a preview of the coming kingdom, which would speak of authority, and the command to listen to Jesus, I think, which has authority into nations. Nonetheless, most of the imagery speaks in the Transfiguration scene to, I think, his glory. So ultimately, we can't separate Jesus's authority and his glory. So again, this view has some merit. You can hear I'm totally a both and type person. I never make any decision. That's what you're hearing from me. I do make some decisions, but second, some say Moses and Elijah appear because they both have questionable deaths. Elijah was taken up to heaven before his death, and although Deuteronomy 34 reports Moses died, there is some mystery surrounding Moses' death. The statement that no one knows the location of his grave has caused some interpreters, I think even Josephus, if I'm remembering correctly, yeah, it's in my notes here, to surmise that Moses didn't truly die. Josephus acknowledged that Moses wrote in the scripture of his death, but he wrote this out of fear, lest people should say that because of his extraordinary virtue, he went to be with God. Philo interprets the statement that no one knows the location of his tomb to mean he was not entombed by mortal hands, but by immortal powers, so that he was not placed in the tomb of his forefathers. The view that neither of them died, I think, becomes more problematic as the New Testament confirms Moses' death in Jude verse 9. No, Jude chapter 9. Jude verse 9. The point is we have, I think, both Old Testament and New Testament confirmation that Moses died. So this view, I think, becomes unlikely. Maybe the most positive spin on it is that both departures from the world were remarkable. Moses was buried by the Lord. It speaks of this in the scriptures, a debate even about Moses' burial. And Elijah was physically transported. This might indicate Jesus' transfiguration is a sign of the coming kingdom. All will be raised. Third, some affirm Moses and Elijah appear because both were transfigured or heavenly figures. Moses was transfigured as he beheld the glory of God on Mount Sinai. Or even more relevant is the transformation that Philo affirms Moses underwent at death. Philo says God summoned Moses and resolved that his twofold nature of soul and body into a single unity, transforming, he actually uses the word metamorphosis here, his whole being into a son-like mind. The scriptures don't explicitly say that Elijah was transfigured, but I think they hint at it as Jewish interpreters took this for granted. A flaming chariot comes to pick up Elijah, indicating maybe a change in the nature for Elijah as he traveled up to the heavens, 2 Kings chapter 2. Many Jews believed one could not enter the heavens unless a person's body was transformed. The physical body is not able to enter the heavens in the state that it is. We can see, I think, Paul pulling on that in 1 Corinthians 15. Humans must receive heavenly bodies, and therefore both Moses and Elijah were transformed. Luke is the only one who affirms that both Moses and Elijah appeared in doxa and glory on the mountain, Luke 9:31. This might imply that Jesus's glory was conveyed to Moses and Elijah. However, it could also mean they appeared in glory because they were both now heavenly figures. They had been transfigured. So I'm going to skip a little bit that. I'm going to go to the last view. Finally, many argue Moses and Elijah appear because they both requested theophanies on mountains. I think this is maybe one of the primary points. I think there's a lot of points, but in Exodus 33, Moses asks to see God's glory. On Sinai, Moses has seen things in shadows and obscurities. Now Moses requests to see the glory of God. And God responds in Exodus 33 by detailing what Moses can see and what he cannot see. And then he gives him directions. Positively, the Lord says he'll make all his goodness, or all his doxa, kavod, tov, his glory, pass before him. Though God tells Moses this theophany would be impressive and extraordinary, it would be limited. God tells Moses he can't see his face, pane, for humans can't see his face and live. That's Exodus 33:20. The vision would be a limited exposure. Moses' request concerns God's glory, and God answers with a statement about his face. God then gives Moses directions so he can see his goodness or his glory pass in front of him. And actually, the amount of concealment is stunning. He's to hide in a crevice. God will cover him with his hand. And then when he removes it, Moses won't see his face, but he'll look at his back. It's a revelation scene, but it's also one of concealment. Moses can't see the face of God. He, in one sense, the request is granted. In another sense, it's denied at the very same time. In summary, Moses appears in the Transfiguration because he's requested to see the face of God. While his request was answered in an extraordinary way, it was also limited. God revealed himself in part to protect him, but also to reassure him. I would argue on the Mount of Transfiguration, the request of Moses is now granted. He sees Jesus' face and he hears his name, Son. A very similar event occurs in the life of Elijah. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah hears how Jezebel has killed the prophets of God with the sword, and Jezebel threatens to end Elijah's life, and Elijah flees. Elijah sleeps under a broom tree, and an angel of the Lord appears to him. Elijah walks for 40 days and 40 nights up on a mountain and comes to Horeb, the mountain of God. This is the same mountain, 1 Kings 19:8. Elijah is on the same mountain where Moses received partial sight of God. I looked through most Old Testament commentaries, and most agree. This is the same place, the same mountain. Elijah interestingly enters a cave. Moses entered some sort of crevice in the rock and spends the night there. Most argue, again, this is the same cave that Moses saw the back of God. In this pregnant place, the word of the Lord comes to Elijah, asking him what he's doing in this cave. Elijah is troubled and needs reassurance. Therefore, God tells him to stand, and he will see the Lord's presence. God will appear to Elijah like he appeared to Moses to comfort him. So the Lord passes by him. The Hebrew word avar here for pass by is the exact same word employed in Exodus 33:22, when the Lord tells Moses his glory will pass him by. So same place, same verb, same scene. I just think we're supposed to link these scenes together in our minds as we read the scriptures. But the appearance of God is surprising again. 3 supernatural events occur. The Lord is not in any of them. First, a mighty wind tears through the mountains, then an earthquake shakes the mountains, then a fire bursts through the mountains. This all sounds like Sinai imagery to me, but God is not in any of them, which is surprising to us because it's like, no, that's how God appeared before. After these events, a low whisper is heard. In the soft voice, the Lord appears to Elijah. It's debated why the Lord appears in a whisper rather than the wind, earthquake, or fire. But that's not the point of my analysis right now. What's important is that when Elijah hears the soft whisper, he wraps his face in his mantle. He can't stand unveiled in the presence of the Lord. He can't bear the sight of the Lord even in a soft whisper. And as he goes out to stand at the entrance of the cave, the Lord's voice comes to him, speaks to him, and tells him to go back and continue his ministry. I think the correspondences between Exodus 33 and 1 Kings 19 are uncanny. Both Moses and Elijah went up Mount Sinai to get a glimpse of the Lord. Both had something of God's glory revealed to them. Both had limited visions. Both were hidden in a cave. God shielded Moses with his hand, and Moses only saw his back, and Elijah covered his face when he heard the Lord's voice in a low whisper. So Moses and Elijah appear on the Mount of Transfiguration because they both long to see the glory of God, and now they do as Jesus is transfigured before them. So, conclusion. I'm going to stop talking a minute. You can ask me a million questions. What do we do with all these options? Most of us, I think, are tempted to pick one and say, this is the reason why they're here. I think it's acceptable to admit there's probably many reasons, not only one for a biblical event. However, it's also useful to note some primary and subsidiary points and categorize them for the sake of simplicity. While I don't deny that many of the views have some legitimacy, it's useful to categorize them, I think, as covenantal and individual events because the strongest views largely correspond to Jesus's role. Now we're wrapping back up to my thesis as Jesus as the Messianic Son and the Eternal Son. At the risk of being reductionistic, if one emphasizes Moses and Elijah as covenantal figures, the more modern and common view, then the interpretation will lean toward viewing Jesus as a human figure who's glorified. Jesus is the Messiah as prophesied in the law and the prophets. And I think this is true. However, if one emphasizes the individual experiences of Moses and Elijah, then the key moment in their life that they ask to see the glory of God or even the face of God, that's the key moment. In this sense, interpreters, pre-modern interpreters, should emphasize not only, and they do not only emphasize the messianic tones of the Transfiguration, but the implications for divine ontology. The Transfiguration, I think, is affirming Jesus is Yahweh in the flesh. This is the glory of God. This is the face of God. I think Moses and Elijah appear both as representatives of the Old Covenant and as individuals who had these critical events happen in their life. Skip. Okay. I'm trying to figure out where I want to end. Yeah, Moses and Elijah were not only servants, Jesus is the master, Jesus is the prophet, priest, and king who they've been waiting for. They appear to affirm Jesus's message and ministry as two witnesses. I think these are all true. They appear to confirm Jesus is the final word of God. They appear to indicate the new age is here. This is the first time Moses sets foot in Israel's promised land. All of these covenantal points collide rather than being in opposition. The presence of Moses and Elijah signals Jesus is the long-awaited Messianic Son whom the law and the prophets foretold. However, we can't stop there. Moses not only sees Emmanuel's land, he sees Emmanuel himself. Moses and Elijah asked to see God. This is the primary event in their life. So while we can view them as covenantal figures, we must also view them as individuals. Moses and Elijah appear showing us the Transfiguration is not only about Jesus's messianic calling and his future glory, it's about Jesus having the same essence of the Father. The Transfiguration is the theophany par excellence in the New Testament. Jesus is the eternally begotten Son, the face of God that they long to see. So when we look more carefully at why Moses and Elijah appear, we can see their presence supports Jesus is the Messianic Son, and he's the eternal Son of God. So when the voice says, "This is my beloved Son," you have to double click on that and say, Psalm 2 and more than Psalm 2, if that makes sense. So that's it. That's my whole, maybe, can I share my screen? Maybe I can share my screen even now. Can I do that?
I gave you permission, so.
You gave me permission to do that.
Give it a try.
Oh, there it is. It's right in the middle. Yeah, so I'm happy to take questions, but I just put a little chart right here.
I love charts.
I love charts too. You know that about me.
I know you do.
Yeah,
I know you do.
There's all my views put into a chart that you probably could have had this whole time. I should have.
So students, you can snapshot your screen to get that.
There you go.
We'll give you a few seconds. Well, I'll start off and maybe just take a couple minutes. I want to do lightning round so that we can get you to answer some questions about some of the aspects of the Transfiguration text. I'm looking at Matthew 17. So these are short answers.
Yep. Speed round.
Yeah, speed round. Just things I find interesting. So suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Can you say more about the talking? Sulaleo, which literally means talking with. but doesn't tell us what they're talking about. Is there some significance to this talking? Like, sounds like they're just sort of chit-chatting in the green room sort of thing. What's going on there with the talking?
We get the minutes of the meeting in Luke. He says they're talking about the Exodus, which is
Oh, he
awesome.
does?
He gives
Oh,
us a little more information. They're talking
yeah.
about Jesus's departure is how most translations translate it, but it's actually the term Exodus, which I think they're talking about Jesus's death. They're talking about I
Yeah.
think Moses, we don't know exactly what happened there, but I think Moses and Elijah are like they're getting like what okay, oh the Exodus, oh the Passover, oh it's all making sense. You've come, now you're going through your Exodus, your Passover, you are the Passover lamb. I think it's all making sense to them, and Jesus is giving them a little lesson in biblical history, and they're all nodding. They're like, oh yes, now we understand why all this happened, why this occurred this way. So ultimately the transfiguration, that little detail tells us it can't be divorced from Jesus's death. The path to glory is through suffering.
Nice. Okay, this is going to get really complicated, so just do your best. When we see Moses and Elijah, and I love that in Greek it's a passive verb. They
Yeah.
appear.
Yeah.
Are they disappearing from somewhere else and reappearing here, or has the curtain been pulled back and we're seeing them? We're seeing that they didn't move. We're just able to see them now. Is there a sense of how this uh
How this
epiphany
happens.
works
Yeah.
from a cosmological standpoint?
Yeah.
Are they being transported, or are we just able to see through the veil?
Yep. I don't know if we can answer that question, EJ. I think most of the tradition and the fathers have talked about them being transported, but I think that's kind of symbolic language too. I don't think like the realm of the dead is a literal place that if we dig down far enough, we'll find it, right?
Right.
Nor if we go up far enough in the heavens and the galaxy, we're gonna find the seventh heaven where Yahweh resides. So, yeah, I think ultimately we probably need to not think in like material ways here. It's symbolic language of him pulling. I do think the fathers did say like pulling Moses up from the realm of the dead, and then Elijah down from the heavens. That's the spatial imagery that we get. Many of the fathers did say, how did they recognize this was Moses and Elijah? I say they pulled out their iPhones. They're like, yeah, that's what he looked like.
That's
like,
true.
We don't know.
That.
They thought that many of them said, well,
name tags.
It's like a church meeting, like a potluck, right? They've got a name tag on it.
That's a good question.
Moses was holding the 10 Commandments. I think they just like spiritually understood, or they listened in on the conversation, like, oh, that's Moses, that's Elijah. Cool. Okay, we don't know.
Interesting. So, yeah. All right. We don't know. That's the answer. All right. I've probably the most confusing part for me is Peter and the tents or the dwellings. You mentioned it briefly. Can you say more? What's Peter doing here? Like, what's happening?
Peter's being Peter and speaking before he knows what to say. Mark says he says this because he was terrified. One of the gospel writers says that Matthew says he didn't know what he was saying. So Peter kind of sticks his foot in his mouth. But the more interesting question is in what way? And there's a ton of debate. Like, is he talking about like the Feast of Booths? Is he talking about the tent of meeting? Are there allusions to that? Possibly.
What's your hunch? What's your hunch for the best theory here?
My hunch is that it's not those things actually, and that would be like totally my type of interpretation. That's how I read the Bible, and it's funny that it concluded it's not. That's not what's happening. My hunch is that the problem is that the tents. He's trying to prolong this glorious scene. And so a tent is a place of dwelling.
Yeah.
And then it's also the problem of three. There should be like three tents. He's putting Jesus, Moses, and Elijah on the same plane. And so the problem is both Peter's rejection. We've already seen this of the suffering of the Son. He wants the kingdom to come now. He's like, oh, you're glorified. Let's do this. Moses and Elijah here. Malachi says Elijah's going to come back. I think it's go time. Let's build tents. Let's make this happen from this mountain. Let's go. And then the three tents. The response from the Father is, this is my beloved Son. I talked about like the singular of that. I think there's a rebuke in that from the Father. No, Moses and Elijah aren't my son. They're servants. This is my son. So it's not three tents. In one sense, I'm affirming like the three, there's something wrong with the three and the tents, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
He's singular. So yeah.
All right. I'm turning off your sharing. Okay. Last, and I'm just throwing, an extra thing in here for you. I'm sure you talk about this in your book. When I hear beloved and son, I think David, but you didn't use the name David very much.
I think
I think this is very Davidic, and that, combine that with
Yeah.
like Ezekiel and the shepherd, the one shepherd and the two shepherds and all that. I
Yeah.
think the best route to Jesus' divinity is actually through texts like Ezekiel and the emphasis on this unique son. Um,
Yeah. That's a good comment. I like that. Yeah,
how
that's
right am
helpful.
I?
Yeah,
That's my
you're right.
question.
You're right. You should
That's the
review my
question.
book. I think you're right. I spoke of beloved son connecting to Genesis 22:2, the sacrifice of Isaac, because he says this is my one and only beloved
Yeah.
son, same Greek terminology. So
Yep.
suffering son. Luke says this is my beloved, my chosen one with whom I'm well pleased. He changes the language a little bit in his
Yeah.
gospel. That's Isaiah 42:1, again, suffering servant. And then I think sonship language should make you think of Daniel 7. That's where I went because right
Yeah.
before this text, it's the Son of Man. And then Psalm 2, obviously. So I did a lot with Psalm 2. I didn't speak as much of David. That could have been an oversight, more because I was trying to say, I guess I spoke of David through messianic sonship, and I didn't use David terminology as much because I'm trying to focus on Psalm 2. I could be wrong. I make the argument that Psalm 2 is speaking in the past, in the future, and in the eternal past. That
Sure.
it's eternal begottenness. So like it's everything's in Psalm 2. This is this like today I've begotten him. Well, that's speaking of the resurrection of Jesus, Acts 13, Hebrews 1. That's speaking of the crowning of a Davidic king, and that's speaking in eternity past of eternal begottenness, which not I would say not many scholars agree with me on that one. So I could be all by myself on that point. But so I don't use David's name a lot, but I use the concept through messianic
Sure.
sonship, which is Psalm 2. Yeah.
Yeah, I know you know this, but maybe students don't know. In Hebrew, Dawid means beloved. So
Yeah.
that's just kind of an easy
Yeah.
association.
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
speed
That's great.
round. Jesus came and touched them. There's got to be some significance
Yeah.
to the
I think
touching.
it's I think it's just I could probably say more, but it's man, I know I've meditated more on this. I would just say it's a comfort to them. I think they're falling down as dead because if my argument is correct, they've seen the glory of God and they should be dead. And his touch is a healing,
Oh.
comforting, reassuring touch. There's some Old Testament echoes. I can't remember them right now though. So there you go.
What's the relationship between fear and not fear? Fear is a very normal thing to do with the theophany, like you were saying with Elijah, but then he says, "Do not be afraid."
Yeah, I think he's saying, do
What's
not be afraid, because this number one, my suffering is not the end of the road, this glory, and then do not be afraid because this glory will be yours. So
hmm,
while it is fearful to be in the presence of the living God, in the presence of an heavenly being, an angel for that matter, the command is always do not fear after that. Like
yeah,
I'm here for your benefit. So while it's an awesome experience and you should fear in one sense, another sense, I'm not here to punish you. I'm not here to destroy you. Although I could, I have the power to do that. I'm here to save you.
I like that. This is just a note for anyone here that Matthew 17:8, when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. That's one of the inspirational verses for the hymn "Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus." In case you
Mm.
didn't know, I don't know if that made it in the book, Patrick.
That didn't make
That,
it in the book. No,
that didn't make it.
but
Okay,
there's your
that's one of my
Transfiguration
favorites.
song, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's it.
There it
That's your
is.
song.
There's your song.
Okay, we have
Yeah.
about 10 minutes, and this is an opportunity for students to ask questions. You can go ahead and unmute your mic and ask your question. Otherwise, I could always ask more things. But
I have a
Greg, you
question.
did have a question.
I think, Dr. Schreiner, thanks so much for coming. You answered my first question, but I had an additional question.
Yeah.
You sort of equated transfiguration and transformation. And I
Mm-hmm.
think in the church, we often view transformation as a process.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, is there a connection? Like, is it an event when we come to Christ that is there a sense of the
Mm.
change in us,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
transformation, transfiguration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't spend a lot of time on that. I think you're right about it being an event versus a process. I think the scriptures, but maybe the shortest way to speak of this is that it's both an event and a process in the scriptures, and the two are paradoxically connected. So we will be glorified one day. And in another sense, like when we're saved, I think we are starting to be transformed into that image already now. So the New Testament seems to speak of, if we're going to put it in the concept of like glorification, that glorification is both an event and a process. And so, this is getting to systematic theology categories a little bit more, but I do think our goal as Christians is to become more like the image of Christ on this earth. And then as we see him, we will be ultimately transformed in the final sense. And that the two are put together in the scripture. So transfigured, he was transfigured versus transformed. For Jesus, that wasn't necessarily, it's an interesting question to ask myself. It wasn't a process, and it was a process. It wasn't a process because he's God. It was a process as man, though, because he had to learn. I mean, Hebrews speaks about he had to learn obedience through suffering. And so he's not glorified until after he dies. He accomplishes the messianic task. So that relates more to us. And then I went through a lot of, like, when did he receive then his transfigured body? In the book, I thought initially it's got to be at his resurrection. That's what the church has confessed. But interestingly, Jesus only appears in the New Testament, just note this, as a bright and shiny figure post-ascension. Pre-ascension, he's not described as having a doxa glory body. But when he appears to Stephen, when he appears to Saul in Acts 9, when he appears to John in Revelation 1, it's like this, I can't handle it. So I kind of leaned towards an Origen, even though he's claimed to be a heretic. They decided he was a heretic. Origen backed me up on this one, that there might be a sense in which he did not receive the 1 Corinthians 15 body until his ascension, and that would make sense for why he didn't need a spacesuit. Wasn't that a great ending?
he looked like the cemetery gardener.
That's right. Yeah. When they see him, though, they're not like, oh wow, you're like on the mountain. Yeah. They're like, we can't even recognize you. So the other option, and I don't mean to get stuck on this, but the other option is that he received that glorified body in his resurrection, but he veiled some of that because they couldn't handle it, which is a possibility for sure. Yeah.
That's why I have to decrease the shine in my head sometimes. Similar reason. You didn't mention, but I think it's relevant. 2 Corinthians 3:18 uses metamorphosis as well.
Yes. Yep.
The verb. Yep. Being transformed in the same image from one degree of glory to another.
That's right.
That's the process.
There.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? We got.
And he's speaking about Sinai there and Moses. So
yes.
Yeah.
I have a question that's slightly off what your specific topic is, but at SBL and so forth, the majority of Old Testament and Hebrew Bible scholars place the writing of the Pentateuch somewhere between the 9th and 4th century BC, which eliminates a historical Moses. In any of your readings, did anybody address that conundrum for scholars?
I didn't dive into that, honestly. I didn't dive into dating of it. I was using more of the church fathers to read this. Like I said, there's not many people who are writing this event. So no, I didn't really dive into that in terms of like Mosaic authorship. If you don't believe in Mosaic authorship, I think you could still say Moses is representative of the law in terms of it occurred during his life. So if that's what you're speaking of in terms of authorship, I think you could deny Mosaic authorship and still say Moses is representative of the law. I think that's supported in the New Testament. I'm not sure if that's what your question was getting at, but yeah.
Well, yeah, for me, the fact that he appears in the New Testament, so anybody who believes in the New Testament would have a hard time denying a historical Moses.
Right.
On this basis.
Certainly.
So for me, that's one of the big arguments that can be used with Christians if they believe that it actually was Moses. So anyway, I was just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Do you have any idea why Mark has Moses and Elijah's names in the other order?
Matthew certainly wants to press into those Mosaic traditions more. And so to have Moses first makes sense. And then he's the only one who speaks of Jesus's face shining. And so that's going to represent Moses coming down from Mount Sinai. So it makes sense that Matthew would front Moses just because of the Mosaic echoes that he has throughout his whole gospel. It's also, according to the biblical tradition, the chronological view. So I don't think we have as many arguments for, I think Luke does that too. I think he has Moses then Elijah. It's only Mark who has Elijah then Moses. I think maybe you could make the argument that there's a strong John the Baptist, Elijah tradition going on within Mark's narrative itself, so that there is, you're seeing emphases of each gospel writer by the fronting of names there. So is it Mark? I'd have to go back and think, but in one of the narratives, and it's escaping now, they go down the mountain, they actually ask about, hey, I thought you said Moses was coming, or Elijah was coming back, right? That's the descent from the mountain. And so they're actually asking questions about Elijah right after this narrative, and I just can't remember which gospel it's in, but one of them, that's the case. So short answer is you're seeing emphases of each gospel writer in the ordering of the names.
I want to pick on something you said, Patrick,
pick on it.
in passing, because it's kind of one of these Christological conundrums. You said that something like Jesus is the incarnate face of Yahweh.
Yeah.
And I hear this from time to time, and it kind of confuses me because I like Richard Bauckham's divine identity approach.
Yeah.
I would distinguish that from the idea that Jesus and Yahweh are exactly the same. And the reason is clearly you have Father and Son together in this scene.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So you know, I'm setting you up with a softball here. If Jesus is the face of Yahweh, then who's the person in the cloud saying, this is my beloved Son?
Yeah. I mean, I think you have to have your Trinitarian ducks in a row to be able to answer that question. Maybe I'll answer your question in a different way. I think the Holy Spirit is present in the scene as well through the cloud. I think the cloud is representative of the Holy Spirit. It matches the baptism of the dove appearing, and now the cloud. Old Testament, the Spirit of the Lord is in the pillar of cloud and the fire. So I think there's a strong argument for the whole. It's a Trinitarian scene. And maybe this is answering. I don't. Yeah, tell me if I'm not answering your question, but I do think I argue that it's appropriate that we see. It's appropriate. Let me say this specifically. It's appropriate that we have images or creaturely representations of the Son and the Spirit in the triune God's life because they have missions and the Father does not have a mission. In other words, the Father doesn't have a mission. He's not sent. The Father sends the Son and the Spirit. So therefore, the Spirit and the Son uniquely take on creaturely forms. The Son eternally taking on the flesh, and the Spirit kind of is like, oh, I'll be dove here, I'll be fire here, I'll be cloud here. Does that make sense? So all that to say, because it's 1 and 3, 3 and 1, it's the face, and because man. So this is actually pulling on some Eastern Orthodox theology, but because man is made in the image of God, and humankind can uniquely represent God, God takes the form of man appropriately forever because man is made in his image, and therefore we see who God is, the Father, Yahweh, in the face of the Son because they're united, they're one. But they're distinguished. So you have to have inseparable operations, unity and diversity, right, within the three persons. Is that getting to your question, or am I not hitting it on the head? I feel like I'm not hitting straight on your question, but
yeah. I don't often think
satisfied
in those traditional systematic theology terms, but I guess the question is, a lot of people associate Yahweh with what the New Testament calls the Father, but you're associating Yahweh applied to Father, Son, and Spirit.
Yes. Yeah, I'm applying Yahweh to Father, Son, and Spirit, and that it's appropriate that we never see the Father. And it's actually appropriate because the New Testament and the Old Testament affirm you cannot see God. And then paradoxically, it's like, and you see God in Jesus. And that's what Jesus affirms. So somehow we have to take those two realities and say they're both true. And I think the Trinitarian nature of God can make that make sense. And the Transfiguration is such a clear image of that like when I'm tying Moses and Elijah to wanting to see the face of Yahweh, he's basically like, impossible, you die. Like you can't do this. But then I think that narrative is also pushing us forward to saying, but there will be a provision of that, and that will come in the Son. It's in John that Philip asked, show us the Father. And Jesus says, if you've seen the Son, you've seen the Father. So that's his answer to Philip, right? I think is that John 14. So yeah, I associate the Father and the Father is Yahweh, the Son is Yahweh, the Spirit is Yahweh. And I am using those traditional Trinitarian Christological categories. One of the things I do in this book is I say it's harder to understand the Transfiguration if we're not using those. If we're just using biblical scholarship and the tools at our disposal, I just think we run into some problems with explaining it. And I think the classical categories that have been handed down to us through church tradition actually really bring a lot of light, irony to this text, right? You like that pun? Bring a lot of shining stuff to this text.
I like that. We got to wrap up. We're a little bit over time, but
okay.
So, this is a little tangential, but Philippians 2, when Jesus is given the name that is above every name.
Yeah.
Now I'm curious what you think that name is.
Yeah. I've gone back and forth on that, and EJ, I've struggled with that too. I think it is. I mean, it says the name of Jesus, but the rest of the Bible seems to point towards Son. And that's so that why is that confusing to me? It's because it does say so the name of Jesus. Is it the name being Jesus, or is there a different name? You know what I mean? Like, is that the content of the name? I've struggled over that. I tend to think based on the Old Testament, this is my beloved Son, Psalm 110:1, that it's Son, Hebrews 1. So he's given the name Son, like the Messianic Son, because he's eternally the Son. And so that's the paradox of the New Testament, right? That he can both be designated and appointed to something, but he's also always had that from eternity past.
Already had it, yeah.
But you have to, that's the mystery of Christology. There's two natures in one person. So you have to affirm two things at the same time. So
that's pretty good. Okay, you passed.
What do you think the name is?
I think it's Lord, because it says confess Jesus as Lord. It's a title.
Confess Jesus as Lord.
Onoma can mean title. Anyway.
Yeah, you might.
I've only written 2 commentaries on it. But you could be right.
You've thought more about it than me.
I'm just kidding. I'm just curious. We could go for hours on Christology, but we're coming from slightly different disciplines here, Gospels and Paul. Okay,
that's right.
We're going to wrap up. Thank you, Dr. Schreiner. This was awesome. If you like the lecture, get the book. I tell you again, just the first 20 pages is a gold mine, because maybe systematic's not the word. He's so organized in the way that he talks about things. And then we didn't get a chance to talk about your method. You use that fourfold sense. Yeah. And I've always struggled with that. You explain it so well here. I really expect you to have that long Orthodox beard the next time I see you, because you're so enchanted with the Orthodox way.
It's coming, and it's turning white, so I'd fit in even better with all the fathers, right?
There you go. Yes. Well, thanks so much. The book is great. I do love this idea of highlighting these neglected subjects, because it's just, I bet this is just a preaching gold mine to introduce people to who Christ really is,
definitely,
in ways that some of the simplistic approaches we take don't. So let's all express our thanks to Dr. Schreiner. Get his book. Can you just give us a taste? What's next? You've already talked a little bit, but just tell us what's next on your plate, and then we'll wrap up.
I'm actually expanding that fourfold sense. A baker offered me a contract. I'm doing a whole book on that, and so you got a little preview of proposing the quadriga is a helpful return that we can make to how we read the scriptures. And I think it's easily taught if you have some structures in place to understand how to do it and how not to do it. And so I'm basically making a large argument for we need to return to the quadriga, the fourfold sense, and then giving examples of how to do that.
I really like it. Can you say really, really quick, what are the 4 things and what do they mean? And then that will whet our appetite.
Yeah. So the literal sense is basically the grammatical historical sense, I think, rightly defined. And so it refers to what happened, when it happened, how it's told, the narrative itself. The allegorical sense is the Christological or doctrinal sense relating to Christ and the church. So not every text, but most texts have a Christological sense and a literal sense, and those are distinguished. But all the fathers say this, it has to be built on a literal sense, because if you're making up things in the allegorical sense that are not based on a literal sense, then you're off and just doing whatever you want to. Also, you have to distinguish Philo's allegory, I think, from Paul's allegory. We call it typology. I think we could reuse the phrase allegory and recover that. And then the tropological sense is the moral sense, and then the anagogical sense is the eschatological sense. And these are all in order. It wasn't until the Middle Ages that John Cassian was like, and Hugh of St. Victor said, okay, this is the correct order. And I think the order is actually important because you start with the literal sense. It's all built off the literal sense. You move to the Christological sense. You move to the gospel, and then you speak of what you do, and then you speak of his second advent. So you just go through the first advent, and then you're united to Christ, and then you act like Christ does, and then you ultimately it points to the new heavens and new earth. So today, before this, I was working on the David and Goliath story. A lot of people are like, hey, you're not David in that story. No, it's Christ. He's the picture of Christ. I want to say, if you first go through the allegorical sense and say he's Christ, and Goliath is a picture of Satan, sin, and death, then you can actually go to the tropological sense and say, as you are in Christ, you are in David, you are to take up the armor, the warfare of, or the armor of the Lord, Ephesians 6. And ultimately, David's conquering of Goliath is pointing forward to when Christ slays Satan and throws him into the lake of the burning fire and conquers the beast and so forth and so on. So it's all wrapped into that. And so it's very different than probably SBL crowd, but here we go.
Yes. Well, your sermons just sound like a blast. You're slaying dragons and stuff. It's great.
People love it. They
thank
love
you
it.
so much, Dr. Schreiner. Pick up his book. Thanks, everybody, for being here. This will be recorded if you missed any part of it, and we'll see you next time.